This is a Alfred Deakin Institute for Globalization and Citizenship Public Policy Forum. We generally have these forums of an evening at Deakin Downtown and increasingly hybrid on Zoom. Today we're on Zoom in the afternoon because of an exceptional opportunity. Thank you, Peter, for inviting us to participate in this forum. Thank you for the wonderful lineup of speakers. I won't say anything more because that's Danielle's job. We've got a really excellent group of people to speak about important issues. If ever there was a time to be talking about the defense and security relationships, now is the time, but that's not for me to say. So thank you, Danielle. Please take us away, and thank you, panel and guests. Thank you, Your Excellency, Ambassador. It's really good to be having this conversation at this time.
Thanks, Greg. And yes, I'll get us started because we have such a terrific panel and lots of things we want to talk about. So we're conscious of being able to get through everything in the time available to us. Thank you to Peter and also to Professor Bagang Hay. But Bagang approached me to chair this panel for his recently graduated PhD student, Dr. Peter McDermott, who's written this very timely book on the Australia-Japan security and defence relationship, very timely with the signing of the reciprocal access agreement earlier this year and the ongoing challenges that Australia and Japan face in terms of security cooperation in the region. So that's exactly what we're here to talk about today. What role can this relationship play in helping us secure ourselves moving forward into the future? And I want to just quickly introduce our panel, and then I've got a few questions to ask, and we'll hand straight over to the panel. So we have His Excellency, Mr. Shingo Yamagami from the Embassy of Japan here. Thank you for joining us. Thank you so much. We have Emeritus Professor Paul Dibb, joining us from the Strategic and Defence Studies Centre at ANU. We have Mr. Peter Jennings, who you would all know from ASPI, the Executive Director of ASPI. And we have Air Chief Marshal Mark Binskin, who was CDF from 2014 to 2018 and has been a participant in the dialogues leading up to the what we see today with the Australia-Japan relationship. And then we also have Associate Professor Rebecca Strading, who is the Executive Director of the La Trobe Asia Institute. And of course, we have Dr. Peter McDermott here, who's the author of the book on the Australia-Japan defence and security relationship. And Peter is going to wait right until the very end to offer some reflections on the discussion that the panel's had in the light of in the light of his book and the discussion. So I wanted to first open by asking the three of our panelists to speak very briefly, just for a few minutes, to make some opening comments about the current state of the Australia-Japan security defence relationship and what they see as the current and future challenges facing the alliance, or maybe some comments on the prospects for its future. So we might start off with asking His Excellency, Mr. Yamagami, to make some comments on this.
Thank you. Well, Air Chief Marshal Mark Binskin, Emeritus Professor Paul Dibb, Mr. Peter Jennings, Air Commander Dr. Peter McDermott, Professor Beck Strading, Professor Daniel Chubb, and ladies and gentlemen of the online viewing audience. It is a pleasure to join with you all this afternoon for this online seminar to mark the launch of Dr. McDermott's study into the history of the defense and security relationship between Japan and Australia. Such an illustrious lineup joining us today speaks volumes about the degree of interest and importance placed in our bilateral defense and strategic relationship. A relationship that continues to evolve as our geostrategic environment changes and our challenges grow. And coming one day after Anzac Day, the timing of today's webinar could not be more apt. I should note as part of my opening comments that much of the post-World War II development in our defense and strategic relationship owes a considerable depth of gratitude to Professor Dibb, with whom I have shared many a conversation about the region and our shared place in it. One might point to the formation of the Deep Beaumont talks back in 1990 as a spark that ignited a recognition that as economic partners, perhaps our interests would also extend to shared security concerns. This was certainly the belief of Sato Yukio, the former Director General, Information Analysis, Research and Planning Bureau in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Japan, and my predecessor both in that role as well as Ambassador of Japan to Australia. I myself have been the recipient of many words of advice from my senpai and mentor, Ambassador Sato, and indeed it was he that introduced me to Paul and the finer points of the Japan-Australia security relationship. Perhaps that makes me a disciple of the Sato school of thought, but it is a philosophy of bilateral relationships with which I wholeheartedly agree. The combined efforts of Ambassador Sato and Professor Deep led in turn to our cooperation in peacekeeping activities in Cambodia and later force protection measures in Iraq. From there, we continue to work together in international missions, notably to East Timor, in Sinai and the Golan Heights, and in A-JDSR operations in Indonesia, the Philippines, and across the South Pacific. Concurrently, we also began to upgrade our legal and regulatory frameworks, from technology sharing to information and equipment sharing, all the way up to the reciprocal access agreement signed by Prime Minister Kishida Fumio and Prime Minister Scott Morrison in January this year. I have made mention on many occasions of the milestone that this represents in our bilateral security and defense relationship, and it is already bearing fruit. I can report that there has already been a considerable uptick in visits by SDF and MOD staff to Australia. This year has also seen a JGSDF liaison officer entrenched with 1st Division headquarters, an historic first and one that complements the liaison officers from the MOD who have worked in and with the DoD over many years. Last week also saw the visit to Japan by Chief of Navy Vice Admiral Michael Noonan for talks with JMSDF. All this has taken place as the scale of our mutual involvement in exercises and training missions has increased. All three of our services regularly engage in skills and capability building tasks together with like-minded partners. This cooperation will be enhanced as we move ahead and in new areas of mutual interest, including space security and cybersecurity. This brings us to where we are today, partners in a mutually supportive security and defense relationship with healthy prospects for much greater growth. This has been a steadily built relationship, reinforced by both our close economic ties, our common values, and our shared strategic interests. That serves us in good stead as the region faces even more severe challenges to the status quo posed by China's belligerence in the South China Sea and East China Sea. Our mutual involvement in the Quad and Japan's strong support for AUKUS means that we will be operating together more often to reinforce freedom of navigation and to counteract threats to regional stability. This will be our greatest challenge, but will also provide the greatest opportunity for building closer ties. What is certain is that in the years ahead, Australia will see a lot more of the JSDF. Through their physical presence here, they will reinforce the message of Japan as a strong, dependable, and highly capable defense partner, a true blue mate who will back you up when things get rough. We are both stronger because of our special strategic partnership, and we are better for the way it has brought our defense and political establishments closer together. Through the course of conversations today, I expect that many potential areas for greater cooperation will be explored, as well as how together we might best protect our mutual interests. Ladies and gentlemen, you are in for a real test, a real treat, so strap yourselves in for what I expect will be the rip-roaring discussion to follow. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And also for your use of many Australian colloquialisms. I think that's very appreciated. I might pass straight over now to Mr. Peter Jennings to also offer some opening reflections, and then to Professor Strating before we get on to our substantive questions.
Thanks, Danielle, and good afternoon, everyone. And Yamagami-san is always a very hard act to follow, so I'll make my comments brief here, but good to see so many friends online. As Shingo has said, the bilateral relationship is in an excellent state, excellent condition at the moment, and I think really is only going to grow into the future. Built on that platform of cooperation, which has been crafted over so many years. At a time when I was in the Defence Department, sometimes it felt that building that platform of cooperation was a bit slow. But I think what it's done is that it's given us a very deliberate and sort of purposive basis to create the legal and regulatory infrastructure that we need to make cooperation smooth. Obviously, I'm talking specifically about defence and security cooperation here. And because we have that basis, we now have both parties are very well prepared to invest in deeper engagement and cooperation. Another point that's worth making is to say that there is a sort of a natural feel to how Australia and Japan cooperates these days, and I think that's built on decades worth of close economic interaction and close people-to-people interaction, and maybe not identical, but certainly very, very similar value systems around support for democracy, the rule of law, an independent press, an independent judicial system. You can't fake these things, you either come from societies that have these things or you don't. And I think that what it means is that we now have a very natural basis for deep cooperation with Japan going forward. And of course, as Shingo also said, it's driven by now a sense of strategic urgency, by which we all understand we're talking about the behavior of the Chinese Communist Party. And I think also we'll probably talk a little bit later today about the trajectory of the United States and the longer term consequences of an America which is more inward looking at the moment than some of its closest allies would want. So what types of bilateral cooperation would I like to see moving into the future with Japan? Well, more trilateral cooperation with the United States, because we need to give the US every positive reason to stay deeply engaged in the Indo-Pacific. And I think we do that by being demanding allies, good allies, but demanding allies that make serious contributions and want the Americans to do the same. I also want to see more in the way of Australia-Japan bilateral cooperation, which is clearly coming, but more in the region as well, more in the Pacific, more in Southeast Asia, perhaps even the Indian Ocean region. I think increasingly we need to develop shared approaches to how we will do things. For example, in the realm of cybersecurity, where often coordinating how we might choose to name and shame a malign cyber actor adds international force to what either country might do separately. And I think that cooperation is emerging as well. I would like to see more of the self-defense force in Northern Australia. It's clear that there are big developments happening, some public, some just beginning to be public, which I think are going to recast the role of the North not only in Australian security policy, but in regional security policy, and it would be good to see the self-defense force there. And I'd like to see more of the ADF in Japan operating out of Japanese bases, all of which strikes me as being a pathway that we are now on and committed to. That's not to say that we haven't had different views in the past, and may indeed continue to have different views in the future, but it doesn't matter. That's all fine, I think, when you have a closeness of partnership that has been created. So with or without the United States, I think the Australia-Japan relationship is now emerging as one of the strategic anchors in the region, in the Indo-Pacific, for stability. It is now building a momentum in its cooperation that it has a potential to become a very significant shaping factor in terms of Indo-Pacific security as well. So I'll stop at that point and look forward to our further conversation.
Thanks so much, Peter. There's some great comments to get us started. Plenty to think about there. And I'll pass straight over to Professor Strading now, to Beck.
Hi, thanks, Danielle. I don't have too much more to add. I think Ambassador Yamagami and Peter have really summed up just how close Australia and Japan's relationship is, not just in the security and defence relationship, but much more broadly than that. And I would like to extend my congratulations to Peter for publishing this book, an extremely timely book, given that the reciprocal access agreement has emerged or has been sort of agreed to this year. And this, I think, is a really significant development, not just in terms of Australia and Japan's bilateral relationship, but in terms of regional security dynamics. As Peter said, this is a relationship that is important for both states, but it's also important for understanding the states' relationships with the United States, and it's a relationship that needs to thrive beyond the United States. And I think that that's what the US Indo-Pacific strategy is looking towards as well. You know, there's this alliance system, the hub and spokes Asian alliance network, and there's this greater encouragement of the spokes working together in a much more cooperative way, in a much more self-reliant way, in facilitating this broader networked sort of regional security architecture. And I think this is what Australia and Japan are doing really well, and in fact could be considered a kind of model for this spoke-on-spoke development of relationships. And I think going back to your original question, Danielle, about the challenges, I mean, I think one of the key ones, and we've already talked about it, one of the driving motivators is really threat perception vis-a-vis China and the kinds of challenges that a rising China presents. And these, you know, this is contributing to this changing order, I think, and that's something that as regional powers, Australia and Japan really have to grapple with. You know, it's affected by a changing balance of power, by rising authoritarianism, the rising power of authoritarian states, but also authoritarianism within democratic countries is an issue. There's trade decoupling, there's deglobalization, there's grey zone threats in the maritime domain. And I think the central issue is, or at least should be for states like Australia and Japan, is how to manage disputes, how to avoid conflict without sacrificing the principles and norms that have underpinned our peace and prosperity for decades. And that is a really crucial challenge for Australia and Japan. And I think that Australia and Japan have demonstrated alignment on some of these crucial issues. And as Peter mentioned, there are points of disagreement between these two states. And one of the most interesting things, in my view, looking at the relationship over the last decade, is how these tensions have been negotiated. It's not, you know, a simple, you know, they naturally share these values, but these tensions have been actively negotiated or even put aside in order to pursue a deeper partnership in security and defence. The other point that I would just like to make about the challenges facing these states is that they're complex security challenges. It's not just military threats. that are problematic for Australia and Japan. It's pandemics, it's natural disasters, it's security, it's climate change, it's energy security. These are challenges that intersect with and exacerbate conventional security threats. And they don't just require a military solution. So strengthening Australia and Japan's relationship requires continued investment, nurturing beyond security cooperation and defence capabilities, the people-to-people, the cultural, the business, the economic links. These have developed between Australia and Japan over decades, and these are the pillars that enable an Australia-Japan security and defence relationship to flourish, for our strategic and our political elites to view each other through a lens of cooperation and friendship rather than through a cooperation of threat, and for greater cooperation to be welcomed by domestic audiences. So I would like to see, Australia and Japan already do this, but continued investment in diplomacy, in understanding each other, in investing in education and shared education links, in more trilaterals, as Peter said, but in trilaterals that are beyond the US as well, that aren't just linked to the US, but we've got a strong Australia and Japan relationship that is, strong across all sectors of the bilateral relationship and that stands on its own 2 feet.
Thanks so much, Beck. And thank you everyone for your opening comments. Well, let's launch straight into some of these questions that our panelists have raised around, the spoke-on-spoke model, the opportunities for the future. And also I want to particularly kind of hone in on something Peter said when talking about how the relationship is going to have to deal with strategic uncertainty. And one of the things that's uncertain moving forward potentially is the role of the US. And while the US may not have been an important focus for this relationship developing, it's true that both Japan and Australia see their relationship with the United States as a very important part of the future security of the region. And yet at the same time, we're faced with the US that is increasingly internally insecure, is less reliable, we've seen has the potential under a different leader to want to withdraw some of its engagement with the region. And so I guess the question is, how can, if we once again face a president in the US that it tends to be more isolationist, is less willing to put resources into the region, what role perhaps can this bilateral relationship play in dealing with the challenges that countries like Australia and Japan will face in a region that has a smaller US presence? I might go first to Peter Jennings and then we'll go over to Mark Binskin.
Thanks, Beck. And sorry, Danielle, I just wanted briefly to reflect on a couple of comments that Beck made. Firstly, Peter, I should have congratulated you for getting the book done. I know that's a big achievement. So from practitioner to scholar, my friend, well done. The other thought, Beck, was talking about how close partners can sort of forgive each other. There's a case study between a couple of submarine contracts that I could think of. We certainly weren't as invested in the Japanese design or as far down the track as we were with the French. But Japan also reacted to that disappointment, I think, in a very mature way and in a way that the French did not. So, sometimes you need your close friend to be prepared to forgive you for silly errors. And Australia owes Japan a debt, I think, for the mature way in which it handled that particular disappointment. But anyway, that's beside the point. Danielle, on the question of the Americans, US isolationism, a return for Trump, role for Australia and Japan in that. Look, the first thing I'd say is that this is not just a problem that we have to be concerned about if Trump is returned. I think it's fair to at least constantly be asking the question, how fully committed is Joe Biden to Indo-Pacific security? Is he as committed as we would like him to be? And on this point, I'll say something that might be faintly heretical to some on the call here, and that is to say, I'm struck more by what Obama, Trump, and Biden have in common than the things that separate them. I mean, yes, very different styles, but they were on a complete unity ticket in terms of wanting to avoid ground wars in the Middle East. And in fact, Biden has, I think, in some respects emerged as more isolationist than Trump, at least on Afghanistan. Trump was preparing the groundwork for an American departure, but he did not pull the American troops out in the disastrous way that Biden did. And as Joe Biden looks at security issues in the Indo-Pacific, I think for him the test is going to be the same test that he's applied to Afghanistan and to Europe, which is to say, where is the vital security interest for America? And the question we have to ask ourselves in the region is, does Taiwan make that cut? Do the Senkakus make that cut? And I think in both cases, the answer is probably yes, but we're both going to be looking for assurances on that front. One thing we can say is that for President Obama, the South China Sea did not make the cut of being a vital American security interest. And the Americans quite consciously took a decision that they weren't going to pick fights in Beijing over the rocks and shoals, as they were known at the time. So if a Trump figure or a Trump-like figure is elected, I can actually see quite a divergence of possibilities as to what might happen. On the one hand, we could have a Trump or Trump-like figure, let's call it Mike Pompeo, something like that, who is going to continue to push back against Chinese bad behavior, human rights violations, forced labor, Hong Kong. I think we can now add to the list of the South China Sea and the East China Sea, we can also add the South Pacific in the light of the last week or two. And I could very much see that being a part of a new Republican administration's approach. Equally, and perhaps this is more specifically tied to Trump than any other Trump-like Republican, I could see a circumstance where Trump sort of comes to office completely unconnected to anything that he's done in the past, thinking that he can now strike a deal with Xi Jinping. In fact, that was really the first year or so of Trump's administration, was that he was going to make a very good friend of Xi Jinping. We know he likes authoritarian figures, and that what you would have there is some sort of G2 type deal cut between Washington, DC and Beijing. And of course, the thing that does to allies is put the fear of God into us, because we can see our interests being compromised in a big G2 deal where there is some sort of tacit arrangement put in place as to which country is going to dominate Australia's nearer region and Japan's nearer region. And so that the prospect of a future Republican administration intent on cooperating with China is in fact perhaps even scarier than the future of an American administration, perhaps it's focused on competing with China. So I guess for me, the key question here is in contemplating different administrations and different future possibilities, the key task to do is to say, well, what can we do to keep the US engaged in the region on the terms that we would like, the terms that Australia would like, and the terms that Japan would like? And you know, what do we have to do in order to achieve that particular outcome? And so 5 thoughts just to conclude on that strand of thinking. The first is we need to be strengthening our own defence capabilities, because we know that almost any realistic future American administration is going to put higher barriers on their own involvement in military operations and activities globally, but I think also in the Indo-Pacific. And how well are we doing that? Well, actually, in terms of strengthening military capabilities, I would give Japan a higher score than Australia at the moment. I'd say probably about 6 out of 10 for Japan and maybe 4 out of 10 for Australia. And the problem of course, is the time lag between the design and the decision to acquire our capability and the time it takes to produce it, which, as we all know, is very slow and not quite in sync with the strategic world that we're looking at. Secondly, we need to build, I think, a framework of heightened deterrence against aggression in the region. And what I mean to say is we have to create more and more barriers around how countries which might give countries pause before they seek to engage in military aggression. Now, that's quite a hard one to score, because I think what Vladimir Putin has done in Europe has been to lower barriers to aggression. But there are some positive signs in our part of the world. I think a recent very positive sign came from Japanese Foreign Minister making it clear that Japan sees the defense of Taiwan as being integral to Japanese security. You can't separate those two entities. I think another example of a greater deterrence to aggression has been the arrival of the Quad, or the re-arrival of the Quad at head of government level, and the arrival of AUKUS, which is clearly something that has Japan puzzled and annoyed. So there are things that we can do that lift those barriers to deterrence. I'm going to score that 6 out of 10 in terms of our performance on that front. And thirdly, we want Xi Jinping and we want the PLA to conclude every morning when Xi Jinping gets up that today is not the day to be engaging in aggression in the Indo-Pacific region. And I'm going to give us a low score for that, because I think tactically we're not doing a good job. We have clearly not been able, for example, to deter Chinese adventurism in the Solomon Islands. We are not succeeding collectively. The democracies are not succeeding in preventing China from engaging in air incursions and sea incursions into the Taiwanese ADIS or into Japanese airspace, or along the border with India in the Himalayas. So that sort of daily deterrence, it seems to me, is not working terribly well right now against a PLA which is intent on adventurism. So I'm scoring as 2 out of 10 for that. The next thing we need to do is we have to build a regional consensus that it's better to work with the democracies rather than to compromise sovereignty in order to operate under CCP influence. And that is, I think, always a daily fight. There are times when you think you're making headway and some success. Things, to me, look reasonably more positive, for example, in the Philippines right now. But we'll see how that presidential campaign plays out. Things have clearly gone backwards in terms of the Solomon Islands, but a negative outcome in the Solomons, curiously, I think, may produce a stronger counter-reaction on the part of other Pacific Island countries that actually don't like this Solomon Islands agreement any more than we do. And so, that might actually help overall in a sort of a longer term sense, help the region more effectively. So let's say maybe our accomplishments thus far are about 4 or 5 out of 10 on that front. And then finally, I think we need to develop projects collectively, I'm talking now Australia and Japan, that will help us to field emerging capabilities, not simply military capabilities, but things that will have civilian applications as well. I'm thinking, for example, like quantum computing, robotics, artificial intelligence and machine learning. The more we can work together to strengthen each other's supply chain needs and deficiencies, the better. And the more we can do in the military space as well, the better, I think, although that's clearly complicated for a number of factors. So how are we doing on that front? Actually pretty well. As I say, the arrival of the Quad, the arrival of AUKUS, I think a very clear acceptance that Japan is going to be a very close partner of AUKUS. To me, that suggests that that bigger picture of cooperation beyond just the military realm is something where there's real potential to make good movement quickly. And so I'm going to score us about 6 out of 10 on the Jennings informal scale of alliance effectiveness. And with that, Danielle, I think I'll stop at this point.
Thanks so much, Peter. I'm going to hand straight over to Mark Binskin to make some comments on this question.
Thanks, Danielle. And I'll start with congratulations to Peter McDermott as well. Good job, Peter. I know this has been passionate for you for a long time. And I'd just like to start with a brand new acronym, a JISOAE, the Jennings indicator score of whatever it was. I'd actually say to you, Peter Jennings, whether a democracy and democracies working together can actually get much higher than some of those scores, but that's another place for another debate.
Interesting.
Yeah. And it's great to be able to be here and talk on this. I guess, as you would imagine, I'll probably build on PJ's comments a bit here as we go through. He and I worked together a fair bit over the years. And I guess I was a bit of a dissenter in the question to start off with, as Danielle knows. The bit about many see the Australia-Japan strategic defence relationship, at least in part, an attempt to work bilaterally on the challenge for ensuring the US remains committed to the region. The answer is yes, but that's actually a bit of a byproduct, because if you think about when this relationship built, that actually wasn't the major issue that was of debate. So it's interesting observation, but in my discussions that I had in it over the years, it was never one of those at the forefront. And if I think about it, when you look at the strategic environment in the lead up to probably the watershed event, so you got 2007, you got the Joint Declaration on Security Cooperation, and the wording that was around that, the ACSA, the Acquisition and Cross Servicing Agreement, I think is the acronym, which was the forerunner to the 2022 Reciprocal Access Agreement. If you look at what was running on then, there was a lot going on, and it wasn't about the US per se, and actually some of it wasn't actually with China at the forefront. So if you think about back into the mid-90s onwards, the ambassador mentioned when we'd worked together closely, and East Timor and Iraq were at the forefront there. But if you look at what was going on in the region, DPRK was running big at the turn of this century and up till about 2014-15 timeframe. So under Kim Jong-il, we had the nuclear warhead testing and the upping the ante. And then under Kim Jong-un, we saw the rapid development of ballistic missiles and their testing towards Japan, which was a concern. We saw increased DPRK aggression along the DMZ. We saw the sinking of the Cheonan, and we saw an artillery attack on Waipiong-do. And so there was a lot going on that wasn't just China. It wasn't just the US. There was actually a fair bit else going on in the region. And then, as a couple of speakers have mentioned, we had Japan and Taiwan and the region seeing a large increase in the Chinese and Russian air activity around their islands. We saw the tensions over Senkaku and China starting to rewrite history in the South China Sea and not being challenged for that rewriting of the history in some ways. And then what also plays out in this when you talk about the bilateral relationship that we've got with Japan is there were other relationships where there were tensions. Australia was having tensions with a couple of regional nations, but also Japan and the ROK over the issue of comfort women and the like. So there's a lot in this century that has built on there. And then I'd say you've got the two key political players that were in the lead up to this before Trump. Prime Minister Abe, a key in driving a more outward-looking Japan and engaging more in security relationships and trying to work the social narrative in Japan in being able to have Japan feel more comfortable as a nation working bilateral relationships and looking at relationships other than the US. And President Obama, and I agree with Peter's Jennings' comments about the Obama, Trump, Biden bit. But you had the infamous pivot back to Asia, which was Secretary of State and President Obama. And I say it's infamous because it actually, from a US security apparatus point of view, PACOM, they were very taken back by that because their view was they had never left. And so that started a debate and actually played negatively into a China narrative as well. So it didn't go down too well. That being said, key aspects of the pivot that were brought up, which were trade and economic, I think were quite important, but it's what's in a message, I guess. And finally, in this long-term relationship and build-up between Australia and Japan, you can have the formal paper agreements, you can have the individual personal relationships, you can have the broader strategic environment at the time and that long-term growth of our relationship. But I would say that the 2011 Great East Japan earthquake and the associated tsunami was really a watershed moment in the relationship. And I'm sure, I haven't read the book yet, but it's well documented in Peter's book. But the support activities conducted by Australians and supported by Japan, because we had to, that's their country, really brought out how far the relationship had developed, not just on paper, but far more broadly than that. And that was brought out by the fact that Australia was the only country other than the US to provide internal air support and move Japanese forces around and move A-JDSR around within Japan. So you may notice I haven't talked a lot about China and the US. They were major actors during the period that we're talking about here, but the Australia-Japan security relationship grew for far more than just a concern about the US and China. So that was a lead-in. That leaves the question, what role might this kind of bilateral security relationship, in fact, what role will this bilateral security relationship play in dealing with the challenge of China's political and military ambitions? Bottom line up front, as a good military man, I would never want to be in a position where one bilateral relationship versus the world is what we're relying on. So this is very important, but it's important in the context of all the other relationships that both nations may have, and the broader set of relationships there, not just bilateral, but far more. And for example, the Quad, which I think PJ mentioned, is one that is very, very important here. And I'd have to say its rebirth, because it wasn't here beforehand, but I think its rebirth with Australia as a part of this has a lot to go with the strong bilateral Australia-Japan relationship and Japan's support in pushing this with the US and India to get India to accept us to redo this. So in a sense, the Australia-Japan bilateral relationship provides channels for more broader regional security engagement. It's important because we have different sets of relationships with regional countries. Australia has different sets of relationships than Japan. And so by bringing our bilateral relationship together, we can leverage off those relationships as well. It also helps us share a common understanding of what we see as the issues and how that's valuable in how we work regionally. For those that work with China a lot, you'll know that they're very good at trying to drive a wedge between nations wherever they detect just a small difference in a view or a strategy or the like. You'll also know when you work with China that they are always on message from the highest echelon all the way down and across. And PJ and I, when we're partners in crime in some of those high-level meetings that we're at, you could pick it and you could see that their narrative matched their strategy. In fact, their narrative probably was a tester for their strategy to see what the view regionally was. And you could guarantee that if the Chinese ambassador said something here, the Chinese ambassador in Tokyo or Manila or wherever would be saying the exact same thing, and they would be mirroring exactly what the PLA leadership was looking to do. And so their narrative is always a press to test of what they're thinking. You can never let anything go through to the keeper, whether it's incorrect or you disagree. If it's not challenged, it becomes the new norm. And if you're silent, it becomes acquiescence and it also becomes the new norm. So any counter narrative or media release or statement after one of our bilateral or multilateral meetings is scrutinized by China for as much about what it says as much about what it doesn't say. So having a strong bilateral relationship with Japan and then taking that trilateral with the US and then taking that quadrilateral with India, A, helps us get a better understanding of China's intent earlier, and B, helps us develop a stronger, more aligned regional response and narrative, because you don't want to have mixed messages when you're working with these nations. And I think we've seen that over the Russia and the Ukraine as well. China always prefers to work bilaterally as well. So it often cites traditional relationships or special relationships. In fact, if they say they've got a special relationship with a country, they're done, because you know where that's tending to head. But this traditional relationships works for some countries because they don't want to have their relationship with China visible. For others, it opens them up to significant pressure. So again, having a strong Australia-Japan bilateral relationship and where we have our different own relationships in the region helps us provide support regionally to some countries in being able to coordinate a response to China's actions. And then ultimately, it helps us in a global response to any coercion that we might see. For example, if China was to take a step and declare an A-JDSR across the entire South China Sea, so an air defence identification zone, first of all, a common message saying why they should never do that is important. But if they were, a coordinated response with the UN or other forums, economic, regional, whatever, would be very, very important. And I see how Australia and Japan can help coordinate those sorts of activities in the region, especially with countries where we do have differing relationships. It's interesting, Australia and the Republic of Korea can do things that Japan and Republic of Korea don't necessarily do together. And so having those sorts of relationships helps. If we need a rapid deployment of capabilities, then having a bilateral relationship is important. And Op-Argos, which is Australia's contribution to the support for enforcement of the UN sanctions on DPRK, is one there where having this relationship closely meant we could deploy airplanes quite quickly to Japan and support them through the agreements that we have for those operations. Similarly, coming this way, the Hayabusa spacecraft recoveries in this country, not just military, we have good relationship and we can work off that. Peter mentioned something I'd like to build on as well as a final point. Probably the most important aspect of a strong Australia-Japan strategic relationship is the personal relationship and the understanding that brings, because it's important when national interests may diverge. And they do. That's the way our national interests are. But it doesn't mean you can't have the robust conversation and have a development of understanding why you might have that difference in a national interest. And so having a really strong bilateral relationship allows you to move forward on that. So there's just some points, Danielle. Hopefully that'll help the discussion.
That's terrific. Thanks, Mark. So now that we've had a pretty great discussion about we could talk about this all afternoon, but now that we've covered, I think, some of the important strategic aspects moving forward with relationship, I might change tack a bit and kind of move a bit back to the focus of Peter McDermott's book. So the book itself takes a historical approach to the relationship between Japan and Australia, the security and defence relationship. So I guess my question now, and I'm going to ask this question first of His Excellency Yamagami, and then over to Professor Dibb. The question is, reflecting on this history of this relationship, what lessons can we draw as we seek to understand and meet the challenges of the current geostrategic environment and economic environment that faces us in the Indo-Pacific? So a pretty broad question, but one that I think could be quite interesting to consider. His Excellency?
Well, thank you. Well, this is such a big, broad question, and I think, difficult to answer in a few minutes, but let me provide you with some, food for thought, and hopefully, given, most of the, participants today from Australia, this might provide some, hot and spicy food, from, Japanese archipelago. One, whenever we hear the word history, in our part of the world, it could be toxic. Given Japan's past history, imperialism, colonialism. Of course, there are some countries or entities, like the Philippines or Indonesia or Taiwan, who have much more sort of understanding posture vis-a-vis what took place until 1945. But in this regard, I think Australia, Japan relationship can provide some kind of model to those who would like to keep on dwelling on the past history, because yes, we are on the opposite side during the Second World War. And come to think of it, in places like, Guadalcanal, or in places like, Kokoda, New Guinea, we have, our boys, our ancestors were engaged in one of the most ferocious battles. But look at what we achieved since 1945. I think it's fair to say, many, I think I was told by one influential member of RSL the other day that Australia and Japan have achieved post-war reconciliation. Now, we have nurtured this special strategic partnership. So I think this could be one model, which our two countries can provide for some members in the Indo-Pacific, because after all, what's more important is what we can do together for the future, rather than keep on dwelling in the past history. One great example is our joint work we have been doing together for the realization of free and open Indo-Pacific. There are various pillars behind this great vision or concept. Maritime security is one thing, development of quality infrastructure is another, humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, and trade and investment realization. In this regard, as has been pointed out by some speakers, my previous speakers, Japan and Australia can be leading nations in this region with or without the United States. That's how far we have come. So I'd like to once again, mention the importance of the roles which have been played and which are being played and which will be played by our two countries, Japan and Australia. Another food of thought I would like to provide with you before I finish is, looking at what has transpired in the South China Sea, East China Sea, including Taiwan Strait, and looking at what's going on in the state of Ukraine. I think it's fair to say that ambiguities, following the end of Cold War are now completely behind us. Some people talked about the end of history, or there are many people who try to incorporate, Russia, China into rules-based international society. We did our best. One time, Russia became a member of G7, making it G8. We tried our best to bring in both Russia and China into the bosom of World Trade Organization. But look at what happened after wars. I think it's fair to say now we can clearly see who's standing on the other side of the river from us, blatantly challenging the rules-based order. So what should we do at this juncture? It's really important. This is a kind of contribution both Australia and Japan can make in order to uphold one of the most important values we have so nurtured since 1945, which is the rule of law. So whether it could be South China Sea, East China Sea, Ukraine, there is a lot we can do together. Once again, of course, the role of the United States is important. We would like to see the leading role to be played by the United States. But apart from United States, there is a lot we can do together. In this regard, my friend, Mike Green, the other day over lunch, he told me, from US perspective, Australia is the most intimate ally of the United States, whereas Japan is the most strategically important ally of the United States. So here we see the division of role, but both our countries, while taking much care of alliance with the United States, but this is high time for us to sort of enlarge our horizon of diplomacy and security policies. This is how I see the situation. So thank you for giving me the opportunity.
Thanks so much. Professor Dibb?
Well, an awful lot of ground has already been taken care of. Just let me make a few points. A number of colleagues have touched on the importance of personal relationships, and not least in Japan. And I might just fill in a little bit of the history of my visit as Deputy Secretary of Defense to Tokyo in March 1990. Remember, the Cold War was still alive in 1990. I had first met Yukio Sato, who Ambassador Yamagami is referred to, in 1983. He was the first, I think I'm right on this, Shingo, Yukio was the first Japanese diplomat to be posted for a year to the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London, which then and now is arguably one of, if not the most important international strategic studies institutes. And at the time when Yukio was in London at the institute, guess who was the director of that institute? Bob O'Neill, the Australian. And he introduced me to Yukio Sato. And Sato-san and I, the next year, had a discussion about why is it that the annual conferences of the IISS are always in Europe or America? Why don't we have one in Asia? And the following year, for the first time ever, the Institute, with the guidance of Yukio Sato, held its annual conference in Kyoto, in Japan. And from then on, Yukio and I stayed in close touch. When I visited in 1990, the first question he asked me, and you'll remember I took along with me the Vice Chief of our Defence Force, Admiral Alan Beaumont, who was a 3-star admiral, in his uniform, into the Gaimusho. That itself was important. There was no uniformed person on the Japanese side. There was Yukio Sato and foreign ministry advisors and a civilian defense official. The first question that Yukio Sato asked me as we sat down was, reassure me, Paul Dibb, that you Australians aren't going to do what the New Zealanders have just done and ban nuclear-armed and nuclear-powered warships, because if you do, that is going to make our relationship, Japan's relationship with the United States, fraught with danger. I settled that one very quickly and said, no, we're not going the New Zealand route. We have different views on these issues, although we have some limits on nuclear-powered warship visits. We then started to talk about the Soviet Union, which I think many of you know I'd spent a lot of my career on. And that moved on to the fact that both of us, and I'll use these words very carefully, as both Mark Binskin and Peter McDermott will understand, Yukio and I discussed very carefully that we both had, what shall I call it, very successful covert submarine operations against the Soviet Navy. In Japan's case, in the Sea of Japan and the Sea of Okhotsk, and in our case, in the waters of Southeast Asia and elsewhere. We then went on, and this was the big breakthrough. Remember, this was the first time Japan had ever had a senior strategic military discussion with any country other than the United States of America. It was a fundamental breakthrough. And we discussed the United States and the Cold War and the Soviet Union. And remember, this was after America's defeat in Vietnam in '75. It was after the Soviet Union had gone into Afghanistan in '79. So there was plenty to discuss. But there were clearly limits because we didn't have an intelligence relationship of any substance. And Japan was not a member of Five Eyes. That's just a bit of history. 2 or 3 points in the context of the discussion we've heard. I couldn't agree more with Peter Jennings that the way the Soryu-class submarine issue was handled in Canberra was an absolute diplomatic disgrace. You need to remember the Japanese ambassador was called in directly to speak to Prime Minister Tony Abbott. When the ambassador came back, and I lived only 8 minutes walk away from him, he said, "Paul, can you get yourself over here now?" And he was ashen-faced, and he said, "What am I going to do? Your Prime Minister has just told me he wants us to build 8 Soryu-class submarines." And I said to him, "Mr. Ambassador, with respect, I'm surprised by that, but not shocked. You make good submarines. You have a lot of operational experience against Soviet submarines. But can I ask you, did our Prime Minister indicate to you how the combat system was going to be installed? Because we are the only other country in the world that has the Virginia-class attack submarine combat system. And we're the only other country in the world to have their ADCAT Mark 48 torpedoes." He looked at me and said, "No," he said, "your Prime Minister said build them and sail them across." And the central point then was people from the 2 builders in Japan who'd never been asked before to export what are the crown jewels of covert military operations, submarines. It was a huge ask. And the issue dragged on. Representations were made in Australia by these manufacturers. They were clearly out of their comfort zone, but they tried their best. And then all of a sudden, the Soryu was, if I remember correctly, Peter McDermott, the Soryu itself was in Sydney Harbour and told to get out really quickly because we're about to make an announcement. And I just think our diplomacy was an absolute disgrace. And secondly, as some of my former colleagues there know, I'm not a technical expert, but the word that went around that, Japan didn't make successful submarines is a rubbish statement. You do not operate in close proximity against the Soviet Navy and make rubbish submarines. I'm not against the nuclear option, but, when I think it was you, Peter, who said, we handled Japan really badly and they responded in a magnificent, diplomatic, mature, balanced way, unlike the French. The other point I've touched on is Five Eyes. Some of you may disagree with what I'm about to say. I believe sooner rather than later, we might go down the path of, here's another acronym, JAUKUS, the Japan-AUKUS agreement. Not for nuclear submarines, that's still anathema, as I understand it, in Japan. But for all the things that have been mentioned, like hypersonics, like robots, like quantum computing, and so on. I think that we are close to having a formal relationship in everything except a written treaty. Whether we can eventually move down that path or whether both sides want to is a matter for judgment. But my personal view is, very personal view, that one day we need to see if Japan would be willing to become a member of the Five Eyes community. And I want to make one very careful comment here. Quite recently, the head of the Australian Signals Directorate, which these days, by the way, is a statutory authority. In my day, Mark, ASD, DSD came under my authority and they were under control. It's not SIGINT for Jesus, it's SIGINT for policy priorities. And when the head of that authority said recently that in her view, Japan could never become a member of AUKUS, of Five Eyes, with due respect to that person, that is not her responsibility. It is the responsibility of the duly elected government. And, you know, I make that very considered statement that in my view, sooner rather than later, it's perhaps a little early yet. Japan, with its domestic situation and the handling of security, is improving. And I just leave that thought with you. A couple of final points. We need to discuss more with Japan and ask for their advice and guidance how they handle China. I'm not being critical of the current situation we've got with China, but Japan, if you noticed, has not got into that trouble to the same degree, although there have been bans of exports of rare minerals and so on. But Japan, and I'm no student of Japan-China history, has had hundreds, if not thousands of years of experience how you handle a major neighbor like that. The associated point is on Taiwan, we in Japan need to talk more, very carefully, off the record, about what we think the United States expects of us both if the balloon goes up across the Taiwan Straits, and what perhaps we could do jointly. And I leave that issue there. It's a major issue, but when you look at the situation in Taiwan, it is clear to me that the United States will expect certain allies to be there, whether we like it or not. And other than Japan and Australia, who are these allies that are going to volunteer to be militarily involved? Well, you can name the ones that won't be. Not any Southeast Asian country, not South Korea, not New Zealand, in my view, not Canada, some of you may disagree with that, not any European country, and that was my view before the Russians have savagely attacked Ukraine. Europe, despite all its promises of French aircraft carriers and British aircraft carriers being more active in our region, let's be very utterly frank. For all the foreseeable future, Russia is going to be a pariah state in Europe. As far as Ukrainians are concerned, and you know, Putin has talked about and has written a 7,000-word document talking about that Russia and Ukraine are one people, one religion, one set of values. Well, he's destroyed that forever, in my view. And depending how much longer this war goes on, and it could go on for a lot longer, and or depending upon whether Putin decides to use a tactical nuclear weapon, and by the way, there is some evidence of that, then Europe is going to be seriously preoccupied with Russia. And to think that they would be involved across the Taiwan Straits, I think is most likely now not a credible situation. That also has implications, finally, for the United States and Japan and Australia, which many of my colleagues have touched upon. My former boss, Kim Beazley, has said to me recently, Paul, and this was before Ukraine blew up late last year, I'd written a paper for ASPI about the de facto alliance between Russia and China. And I use that word advisedly, by the way, de facto alliance of two authoritarian powers who share common views of the world and the weakness and decadence of the West. Kim said to me, I agree, we should worry about that. But Paul, what frightens the hell out of me, Kim Beazley, is that narcissistic lunatic Trump been in, power for a second time. And we've got to think our way through that. And that means centrally Australia and Japan as the two prominent allies. We can't just say go away. We can't say get stuffed. But the issue is, in the meantime, for both the Biden administration and an incoming Republican administration of whatever leadership, God help us all, most likely Trump, America cannot turn its back on an expansionist, aggressive Russia. And that does have implications for Japan and Australia and our concerns about China. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. We've had such a fulsome discussion already, and I was going to ask Beck some questions about regional security architecture, but given that you already touched on that in your opening comments, and given the time, I might actually, and given also that we've got some questions coming in, I thought I might actually just throw the first question to you, Beck. So we have a question in our Q&A here asking about what Japan and Australia can do to handle existing challenges together, and they give the example of the South Pacific, how they can cooperate together in South Pacific with particular reference to what's happening in the Solomon Islands at the moment.
Yeah, thank you, Danielle. And I was going to talk about the importance of creating inclusive and robust security architecture. And that's really of central importance when thinking about relationships with smaller powers. So we have, the development of these new strategic mini-laterals like the Quad and like AUKUS. And, they're based on sort of a shared sense of threat perception and alignment, and they do provide the member states with an opportunity to try to shape the agenda, to come together to talk about these serious issues, but they can also be viewed as exclusionary and also sidelining more conventional forms of multilateralism, which include smaller powers. And of course, the Indo-Pacific is this vast maritime region, and smaller powers, and particularly small island states, are becoming increasingly prominent because of their location and because of the kinds of hedging strategies that these states try to adopt. A lot of them are trying not to take sides. They're trying not to antagonize China, and they don't necessarily share the same view of China as what Australia and Japan do. And so Australia and Japan need to be sensitive to that. That's not something that can just be wished away. And one of the issues with Australia's relationship with the Pacific, I think, is that there is a fundamental difference in threat perception. Pacific Island states don't view China as the biggest existential threat. They view climate change as the biggest threat. And so for Australia to continue to have influence and to be a persuasive factor in that region, then it's going to need to tackle some of those issues, not just avoid them, but actually meet some of these smaller island states where they're at and thinking about how they view security rather than sort of trying to impose our will upon the region. And I think, I can't believe I'm really doing this in a sense, but I think I need to defend the French here, because the diplomacy around AUKUS was pretty bad, like not just in terms of the French, but in terms of our regional neighbours, including in the Pacific and Southeast Asia. And so while I agree that, that it would be good, because France is an Indo-Pacific power, it shares similar sort of maritime and territorial concerns as what Australia does across not just the Pacific and not just the Indian Oceans, but also the Southern Ocean. I think it would be good if, we could sort of get past this particular issue. I think that there is a really important lesson in all of this, that states, particularly in this case Australia, does need to take diplomacy a bit more seriously. And, it does do a lot in the Pacific Maritime Security Program, patrol boats, these sorts of the Pacific Step Up, these sorts of initiatives are important. And of course, Japan does a great deal in Southeast Asia on maritime security cooperation as well, capacity building, Coast Guard training, maritime domain awareness. I think if we're thinking about what Australia and Japan can do in the Pacific. One is create or establish new forums for really bringing these states together with the Pacific Islands to talk about security challenges and to talk through these security challenges. The second is to join up some of what's already going on in the Indo-Pacific and what states are doing in capacity building. You know, maritime security is of central importance to Pacific Island states. They have massive exclusive economic zones. Fishing industries are important to economic prosperity. Climate change has the potential to erode their maritime rights entitlements, which will have impacts on, you know, development and coastal livelihoods. So addressing these sorts of issues collaboratively, I think there are a lot of opportunities for Australia and Japan, but we need to be very conscious that not all states in the region share our view on their own security interests and what matters for them. And what they do and how they think about security ultimately matters for us as well, and our sense of national security.
Thanks, Beck. We've got some time now, about five to 10 more minutes for Q&A from the audience. So I've got one question in the Q&A that I might, that is about actually Japanese politics. So I might direct that question to the ambassador. The question is around, this is not a question that I am familiar with, but I'm sure you know what they're referring to. So recent debate in Japan, calling on Japan to increase its defense budget, kind of in response to Russian aggression in Ukraine. I guess the person asking this question was just hoping for some commentary on it.
Well, I think, in light of, this deteriorating, security environment surrounding Japan, I think it's fair to say that people's mindset have been, undergoing, I think, quite a significant transformation. I think it's fair to say that. And yes, there is a great deal of remnants of past, post-World War II pacifism. That's for sure. Yesterday I was attending Anzac ceremony, and I was once again told at War Memorial that Australia forces lost 62,000 soldiers, and New Zealand 40,000. So in total 102,000 during First World War in European front. But the same number, almost the same number, 100,000 people. I'm talking about not soldiers, sailors, but civilians lost their lives just over a night on the 10th of March in Tokyo because of air bombing of the city of Tokyo. So still, I mean, I'm referring to this just to, share the understanding of, how much, strong anti-war feeling is still, shared by a number of Japanese. But that said, given the egregious nature of behavior, committed, in so many parts of the world we mentioned today, I think a time has come for many Japanese to wake up to strategic reality they are facing. So LDP has come up with, election pledge that they are going to increase defense expenditure to 2% of GDP. Already, according to NATO calculation, Japan's spending is calculated to be around 1.24%, including the budget for Coast Guard, including the budget for pensions. But there is no question, according to many strategists, there is a long way to go. So in this regard, yes, we have a lot to share with Australia when it comes to our history of, dealing with the Middle Kingdom, how to take a safe distance from them, despite, tyranny of proximity. But that said, we have a lot to learn from Australia's experience, especially in terms of defense buildup. That is my take.
Thank you so much. Very interesting. You know, I think there's no, oh, wait a second, I've got another question in the Q&A here. A question for Peter, I assume for Peter Jennings, who's been speaking. Peter, did you want to touch on this question? It's around, I have to read it now. So the question is that Japan has been focusing more on homeland defense with the example of Western Island defense, and that the focus on international cooperation, perhaps they're a little skeptical about it. What are your thoughts on that matter? Oh, it's for Peter McDermott, sorry. Okay. So actually what I might do then, thank you for clarifying that, Yoji. I might actually then hand over to Peter to have the final word. Before I launch this book officially, why don't we turn over to our guest of honor, who has put together, you know, congratulations, Peter, on your book, and also for pulling together such a distinguished panel of experts who are willing to talk about some of the insights from your book. I think that's a great credit to the work that you've done and the relationships you've built. And also, I think that the quality of the discussion is also a great indicator of the importance of this book as well. So I'll pass over to you to have some final thoughts and words on the panel, and then I'll officially launch your book.
Thank you, Danielle. That's very kind. And I see that my good friend Yoji, we are sort of partners in crime in this area, has sent in a question there, and I'm grateful to that. You always say grateful to a question when you have to think about what the answer will be. Let me just go back to some beginnings, though. The ambassador spoke about a spark lighting off the relationship. I might say that it was my great fortune to be working for Peter Gratian, who started that process in 1989, when together we went to Japan to start the dialogue process. I think I came back with a flaming match and took it into Paul Deb's office, or maybe it was a grenade, I'm not quite sure, into Alan Beaumont's and Paul Deb's office. And I said, I think the CDF wants to see you now. And that's what started the process off. And I was very grateful to have the opportunity in the 90s to be able to develop that process. As often happens in military organizations and military relationships, you can do things and then seek forgiveness for them afterwards. And we did a little bit of that. We had exercises and things that went on. And I was told that as long as it's over the horizon and no one gets to know about it in the newspapers, it's okay. So we did that, and that went forward, and lots of things happened. Around about 2000, the Trilateral security dialogue came into place. It was secret, but then with the assistance of the Americans, I won't quote names, it's in the book, we found that there was a trilateral relationship there that was innate and really needed developing. That went forward, and lots of good things happened. The economic and the security and defence issues came together, and I found it difficult when I was preparing the book to separate the two. So that's what I did. I separated them. So there's a security history and a development, beg your pardon, a political and security history, and a military and defence history there. And they fed off each other. So as has been mentioned by folk already, Iraq, East Timor, and a raft of other things happened. They came together, they happened, and the relationship sat there. Sometimes it didn't move forward, but it never slipped back. And we found over time, as Mark Benskin has said, that the relationship grew together because it was of the interests of both countries to be able to do so. What that then meant was that over time, and especially since the 2007 Joint Declaration on Security Cooperation, we now had things in place that made us look like we were working together. And the latter part of my book speaks of an alliance. The Yoji-san, the word is Jundomekanke, or translates into a quasi-alliance. Some folk don't like that, but what we effectively have is that if we had been doing this with any other type of arrangement in accordance with Alliances 101, we would come together politically, we would have a declaration, we would then start putting things in place, we'd talk about legislative changes, we then talk about how we might do things, and then we would pursue interoperability of forces. We're doing it the other way around. And that was my observation and what caused me to write this book, that if we have been doing things together and we're moving almost inexorably towards a quasi-alliance, not nominating who a threat may be or threats may be, and not saying that there will be a reciprocity of relationship of response as we have in the ANZUS alliance there, but moving together in such a way that we have all the elements of an alliance in place, except the final political statement across the top. Now, I think Paul Dibb said, and I see you nodding, sir, I think you said that's possible. And I'm reminded of the 1996 Keating initiative, which resulted in the Indonesia-Australia Security Agreement, which was just like that. It was a political statement that said, we will work together to meet the common danger. It did not speak of threats. It did not speak of mutual reciprocity. But that sort of thing, I believe, is the sort of thing that we now need, because we effectively have an alliance in place. Now, the signing of the RAA on the mid-February, only a few months ago, I think both countries put out statements relating to that and said that there's a possibility that we may be working towards that. And Peter Jennings mentioned that recently in another forum. If that is the case, then what we need to do is to take that 2007 document, update it, and move it to the future. Anyway, the rest is all in the book. Yoji has put me on the spot, and he and I have had long discussions, sometimes over Shiraz on this, or sake. And what he's saying is that, yes, we do have things in place. We can cooperate in Northeast Asia in a collective security arrangement. What is not immediately transparent or politically obvious is what would be Australia's reasons for doing so. The first answer, of course, is it is in our interest to ensure that there is peace and prosperity in Northeast Asia, but it may be a little bit of a one-way trip at this stage. Australia saying, we want to work with you. Would Australia expect Japan to come to our aid? That is something that I speak about in my book, and all I can say is you're going to have to buy the book to have a look at it. A couple of things that are in there. Paul Dibb, I did speak, and I got some stuff, some on the record, some off the record, on the intelligence relationship. It always was there, but maybe not very substantial. And I do speak about the security, the submarine relationship there and how that happened. And if I may embarrass my past CDF colleague there, when the triple disaster happened, I believe you called up your opposite number on the other side there, who was cowering under the desk after the earthquake and said, what can we do for you, Rocky? Well, Benny, good to hear from you. We would like the following things. It's that personal relationship that is so important there. Anyway, noting the time is coming up, and being a navigator, I've got to be on time on station. I pass it back to you, but I would just say that halfway through this meeting, there's a knock at the door and the book has arrived. It's there. Oh,
well done.
Focus, what's going on? There it is. The book has arrived, and I wish I could pass over autographed copies to you. Over to you, Danielle.
What terrific timing.
Yeah.
Well, I might declare the book then officially launched. Congratulations, Peter. Do you have a link that people can go to purchase the book that you can share with
us? Yes, I do. If you look on the registration document that came out to all of you, on the bottom page underneath book launch, it says in slightly different color, might be different than on your browser, but it says this book covers, and that is a hyperlink. And if you click on that link, you will get an offer from the publisher, 20% off. And God bless the publisher. But academic books don't pay too much these days. I'm more interested in getting the message out than helping my bank account for my cruising.
Yes, right. Absolutely.
Thank you so much. And thank you again to all our panelists and our guests for coming. I hope you have a wonderful afternoon. And I look forward to seeing you all again soon. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Congratulations once again, Peter.
Well done, Peter.
Thank you.